Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about composition and something that is kind of a little meta about the perception and the broader topic of Gestalt theory, which is a pretty interesting topic in perception psychology, and I wanted to touch on it because I think it's a little bit under discussed, and it actually has a lot to give us food for thought and stuff we can actually use in our images on a daily basis. So let's have a look at it. So first things first, what's the Gestalt theory? Though I'm going to be very quick on this one. Gestalt theory emerged in Austria and Germany and basically focused on sensory perception and its psychology. Gestalt basically means shape or form in German. And I'll stop here because we actually don't really need that much details in order to what it is. What I want to focus on more is why it matters to us. There's a kind of common misconception around Gestalt theory because since we think, it does, but we tend to think that it actually applies just on pure shapes and simple things and simple images. We tend to think that it will become irrelevant when you start to deal with photographs and more complex scenes. Because Gestalt theory is usually abundantly used in graphic design and UI and UX, so user interface and user experience, basically. So the thing that is interesting to understand, though, is that when it comes to perception and when you look at an image, there's actually different types of reading. And this sort of first type of reading, or the first thing which is called perception, is when you look at an image, the first thing you'll see is actually stuff you won't actually analyze really. And your brain is actually going to gather the image you're looking at in some sort of more abstract shapes. And this is why actually in the end, this is what is interesting for us, is that all the kind of laws that comes with the Gestalt theory actually will apply, because these abstract shapes that we extract intuitively from images are actually governed by the theory of Gestalt and how we sort of group elements together and understand the image. So why is it even more interesting for us to have this understanding is that basically the idea is that once you look at an image and you understand what is the effect happening, what you can do is to understand and deconstruct that effect through your use of Gestalt theory and other theories that I might mention in other videos. And this idea that you can deconstruct the effect by understanding it properly means that you can sort of reverse engineer it and reuse it to recreate that very specific effect in your image, because that's the whole point of references, is that if you don't know how to create an effect, then you actually can't really create it. And the best way to learn how to create an effect is to actually analyze how that effect is created in another image, deconstruct it, reconstruct it by having a thorough understanding of it. And Gestalt theory is actually a very good base that you can use in order to understand how things work in terms of perception. So there are many laws in Gestalt theory. I'll focus on the 5 main ones in this video so that it goes a little bit quick and that you can actually, it's the main ones, so you're going to be able to use them very quickly in your images. You'll see actually, and this is what is interesting, is that you're most probably already using them, but the act of using them mindfully will actually completely shift the way you use them and the way, the power you can actually get out of them. So let's get started with the first Gestalt theory, or Gestalt principle. So let's start with the first Gestalt law called Figureground relationship. Figureground relationship is interesting because basically it's a very simple one that states that basically it's the idea of the relationship between the foreground and the background. It's that the clearer it is, the more focus you'll be able to create on the object in the foreground, because by default our brain is sort of going to focus and concentrate on the area that seems to be in the foreground. So Figureground relationship really is this idea of the sharper or the more contrast you have with the background, and the more your shape of the object or the point of focus is legible, the more your brain and your eyes are going to focus on this area. If we lower the contrast between these and this sort of line becomes less and less easy to draw, then your focus will kind of be lost. This is the idea actually, the sort of that whole check that you can make for the FGR is really this idea of how simple it is to actually draw the contour of your or the edge of your subject. So if you can do it, then your sort of AGR is better defined, and it means that your focus is going to be better defined. Again, just one thing that I want to mention is that it's not like positive or negative. It's just like a state of fact of like how your brain is going to work and how your brain is going to perceive the image. Another law that is interesting is the law of proximity, which basically tells us that we're grouping elements depending on how close they are from each other. So if we look at this image by Jeff Wall, we can sort of understand that our brain and our eyes are going to group these elements together because they are close to each other. It doesn't matter if they are completely different. So if you have like a square or a triangle or whatever, if they are close to each other, you're going to group them together. This guy is going to not be grouped with anything because there's no similar people around or similar shape to be grouped with. What is interesting with that basically is this idea, I'm not going to touch on it too much, but this is something you need to understand, is that the fact that we group these people means that they're perceived as group by definition. And in terms of visual weight in composition, groups have like a completely different weight compared with a single individual or single object. So the fact that you understand how you can create group and how you can sort of isolate people means that then you're going to be able to completely shift the focus and the overall weight and dynamics in your image. If we look at this image by Gregory Crutzen, here you can see that we can't really group these people because they are completely individual, looking on the other way actually. This is something that plays a lot as well, but you can see that they're very standing like individually. What is interesting is that if you completely just a second, if you erase that image or like sort of change it completely and have this image here, you can see that once you start putting them one to another, looking in the same direction, they actually start to be perceived as a group, and the sort of understanding that you have of this scene is actually completely different from the one we had just before. So you can see the power of grouping actually has like psychologically a completely different way of being perceived by your brain, and then just in terms of storytelling behind that, you can start to understand completely different the way things are happening in your image. So this is something to keep in mind, and that really completely relies on the law of proximity. Another law that is interesting is called the law of continuity, and it basically states that elements that are ordered in line or soft curve seem to be more related to each other than random ones. And another thing that is interesting with that is that it also has this ability to create abstract shapes out of elements. I'll explain that in a minute. So basically here, what we want to understand from this sort of law is that the idea that we will relate those elements together because they sort of create a shape or a line that way. If we look at this other example here, it's kind of the same. It's like we have all these individual elements here, but they are very close and they are like sort of organized in an orderly manner that sort of create this sort of S shape here and here, which is very interesting for us. What also is interesting is that in terms of perception, again, what I was saying also earlier in terms of visual weight is that here, by having this perception as a sort of line, is that we actually perceive it abstractly as a line. And we know that in terms of composition, lines are very important in order to create dynamics in an image, because we tend to follow lines in the same, especially when they are either curves or like diagonals. Very straight and horizontal vertical lines have less weight in an image, but diagonals are way more dynamics. And here you can see that we are basically perceiving this plus even the road, of course, we are perceiving all this as a whole, as a sort of like S shape and a curve. And here's the same, etc. So this, at least for the part of these garden part here, is part of the Gestalt theory of continuity, is that we have all these elements that are continuous and we perceive them as a single shape. Another law that is very interesting in terms of Gestalt theory is the law of similarity. And this, from this one, we can draw many interesting facts in terms of like how you can compose your image. The basic idea from the similarity is that we usually use it as a UI and UX, as I said, because we sort of keep the same aspect for similar buttons, for instance, because the idea is that we relate elements and give them similar weights and sort of create relationship between elements that sort of look similar. This is very simple to understand and logical, but once you sort of like think about it a bit more thoroughly and deeply, you can actually see how many relationships you can create in an image. So for instance, in our little image here, this is done like an image I did a while ago for a competition. I actually did a teardown of this if you want to have a look. What is interesting is that we were creating something very specific regarding how we want to create like similarity and create links between elements, is because we had those big containers like painted yellow, and it helped us in being like signals in the project. So in the image, we also use them like in a way that they look similar, so that we can sort of link them together and understand that there's different parts of the project happening. Another example that we can use is, for instance, this one, where you can see that the houses or housing complex have like the same exact color, etc. So we can sort of start to link them together and understand that this project is the same, relate to the same project, and everything is like the same plot, etc. Another one that is quite interesting as well is this one, where basically the similarity in color from these two elements has like the impact of creating a sort of relationship between those two elements, and they start having like more weight in the overall frame, because what they do is that instead of like functioning alone, the window or whatever, what they do is that they have like a counterpart, and it does create a relationship, and that way we have like a sort of more tension created and a difference in visual weight, because suddenly in this image this becomes like very important and has like a lot of weight. And what is interesting is that then you start playing around with the chair and the flowers here, and then more generally or more broadly, then you start paying more attention also with the people that are in the relationship that you have between the kid and the mother, etc. So this is like, of course, in composition, there's always like different dynamics at play, but the fact that we have the play with the yellow thing here is entirely part of the law of similarity and how we can relate to each other, these two elements, even though it's just a flower, like a bouquet, and a chair, which has nothing in common except the color. And we're already at the last and fifth law of Gestalt that I wanted to present to you today. It's called the law of closure. And this law is very interesting because basically what it states is, and it's very easy to grasp, is that basically a certain part of composition sometimes suggests a pure shape, and this perceived shape will usually help in structuring the image. There are a couple of like composition or framing actually tricks that rely entirely on the idea of the Canisa triangle. So just to sort of explain it for people that are blind, but basically the idea is that by simply suggesting the shape here, you can actually understand the overall shape of a triangle here. So even if you don't actually use the whole rest of the image to define those edges, your brain is actually able to read that as a pure shape. What interests us, like this is like a very simple example here where you have like a light bulb done by the hand, etc. So this is a very basic example, but just to show you that it actually helps or works with like real elements and with like slightly more complex shape, in the sense that this is not it's a circle, but what you understand is that it's a light bulb. It's not just a circle, because, well, we have experience when we are looking at images as well. What interests us, and I think is like a little bit more interesting as well, is what we call in photography the frame within a frame system. And here what I find interesting, so this is a photograph by Gregory Crutzen. What is interesting is that we have this sort of closure Gestalt theory that is done by actually defining a sort of subshape here with those this line, and this line. This one we kind of have it with the crossing path, we kind of have it with the thing. And what is interesting is that basically the concept of the frame within a frame is that you have your main frame and you sort of reframe your frame with a sort of subframe that can have like whatever shape you want. And then within that new frame, you actually have a sort of new story. So here in that big frame, we have like the car happening, and in that subframe, we have the woman on the crossroads. And what is interesting is that by creating this perfect shape here in our minds, because as I said, it's like we sort of create it in our mind because it's not entirely here, we still have this perfect rectangle here that sort of draws our attention. And the thing that is interesting is that we do like the fact that it's perceivable, even if it's just on another level or like a subconscious level. It still has a weight in the overall composition of the image, and it still helps in actually anchoring the overall image on that side of the image rather than actually perceiving everything as a whole and perceiving everything as like a sort of equal visual weight. We have like a lot of visual weight because of the person here in the card, but the fact that we have that person framed with that element here, and the fact that we perceive that framing because of the closure theory helps us in actually accentuating the weight of this element in the image. So this is kind of the point of the closure theory. So that will be all for this sort of very short and introduction on the fundamentals of Gestalt theory. As you can see, there are pretty simple concepts to grasp and very like intuitive, but the power of this really relies, as I was saying in the introduction, in understanding, like actually understanding how things work, what are the effects created, and how you can actually recreate those effects by actually reverse engineering it and using it again in your next image. So all those 5 laws are very easy to use, very intuitive, but once you use them mindfully, they have like way more power than when you're just like randomly placing elements and randomly composing your image. So yep, that'll be all. Hope this was very useful for you and that you'll find ways to use it, or actually the other way around is that you can actually look at your project already and sort of see if you've been using it, like, but not really being conscious of it, sorry. If you want a deeper understanding on this topic and on the topic of composition as a whole, you should check out the masterclass that I've been running lately. I'm fine-tuning the details for the next cohort. I've changed many things. It's starting to be like a very dense and packed project and course, so I'm starting to be very, very happy with the content. The past attendees also have been quite happy so far, so that's good. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next cohort. Either way, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers, bye.